Welcome to the Therapeutic Food Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Marian Mitchell. I'm an integrative nutrition health coach, therapeutic diet expert, and founder of The Road to Living Whole. There are many different diets out there. It's hard to know which one is right for you with your chronic illness and autoimmune disease. In this podcast, I'm going to share with you the foundational pieces every single therapeutic diet out there shares, and also how to use the best one for your particular diagnosis. If you've been looking for a meal planning partner, help navigating the complicated healthcare system, and want to feel better quickly, I'm your girl. Grab your kombucha and notebook. Let's dive in. Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Joining me today again is Dr. Bill Rawls, and he joined me in an earlier episode, and he is back today, and we're diving into a completely different topic, and one I'm really excited to learn right along with you, and it's the microbiome cancer connection. And Dr. Bill has a book, what's the name of it? The Cellular Wellness?
Cellular Wellness Solution.
Yes. I spaced. Yes. I have that book on my coffee table, still reading it. Absolutely love it. Today, we're going to be talking about this, and I am so excited. So for those people who are maybe new to the podcast or haven't listened to our previous episode, can you give a brief introduction of who you are, kind of how you arrived at this journey, and then let's just dive into the topic of the day.
Yep. I would be glad to. I am a physician. I've been a physician for 30 years. I was trained conventionally, went into obstetrics, specialized in obstetrics and gynecology. Did that for 20 years, but with the really rigorous call schedule of being up every second to third night and not getting sleep, and just frankly not having good health habits, being chronically stressed, I lost my health and had to stop doing that profession after about 20 years, and ended up really focusing on health for my own benefit and for my patients too. Found a diagnosis of chronic Lyme disease and now recognize that that really has a lot of commonality with fibromyalgia and a lot of other chronic illnesses. And fundamentally, most chronic illnesses have common roots. And ended up using herbal therapy, which changed my life, and just have spent the past 15 years and exploring what exactly is chronic illness and what are the root causes, as opposed to how do you treat this, and why herbs are so valuable in helping us address some of those root causes. So that's where I am today.
Yeah, in our last episode, we talked about how these herbs that are today are an addition used to just be part of our diet. We used to have a varied diet where we were eating over 500 different plants a year, maybe
Yep.
even closer to 1,000. And nowadays we're down to maybe 50.
Yeah.
And so, these herbs were really just part of our everyday eating. And now we have to supplement them, but they have so many benefits. I just kind of wanted to recap that because a lot of people, when they hear herbs, kind of get this knee jerk, like, ooh, I don't know, especially if you're new to the, holistic wellness world. And I love to I point that out to people a lot. Like, these used to be just what we would put in our food, and we just we're not growing them as much now. So, after we spoke last time, I wanted to have you back because you just are this wealth of knowledge. And so today we're going to talk about the microbiome cancer connection. So let's dive into that. And why are you so passionate about this topic?
Well, when we look at that word cancer, nobody likes it, but we're seeing it a whole lot more often. And over the past several decades, century, cancer has been on a steady rise. And instead of asking, well, what's causing it and addressing the underlying causes and possibly decreasing the incidence, all of our focus has been on treatment. And you see fundraising for it, millions and billions of dollars spent in cancer therapy. And physicians and healthcare experts are patting themselves on the back of how these new therapies are saving lives and decreasing the incidence of death from cancer, but they're not preventing it. We're doing a really terrible job. The incidence of cancer is going up steadily. And if you get cancer, it's not a picnic. I mean, they may save your life, but it's going to be horrible. And that's going to put you at risk of all kinds of other therapies because these things are very toxic. Cancer therapies are very toxic.
So I'm
And
sorry to
so,
interrupt. I just have a story to share that I thought was really interesting. I used to be, I still do a little bit, but I used to be a full-time sign language interpreter, and I did a lot of medical interpreting. And one of my clients, her intestines had melted and fused together. And they asked her, "Hey, have you ever been on chemotherapy? Because that's a side effect." And my
yeah,
mind was blown. I was like, it literally melts your intestines and they like mesh together and become this big, large lump instead of this functioning entity. Like it's not a picnic at all, even if they save your life.
yeah, yeah. Well, when you look at cancer therapies, what they're designed to do is kill cancer cells. But they're also stressing and killing the other cells in our body. They're not specific. As much as we try to target them, still there's collateral damage. And most chemotherapy agents and other cancer therapies are focused on killing fast growing cells. And we'll get to that. That's one of the keys to really understanding cancer. Cancer has unrestricted growth. The cancer cells just keep growing and growing and growing. So we have to kill them, but when the expense is killing normal cells, there's always going to be that collateral damage that people are going to have all kinds of issues. And cellular stress is the root of all chronic illnesses. So anytime you do that, you're going to set yourself up for other kinds of chronic illness.
Let's talk about prevention because that's really where it's at. Like you and I both know there are studies out there from other parts of the world, not necessarily the US, that talk about things that prevent cancer or, things like that. Let's introduce people into that.
Yeah. Well, that's the really great thing. And, when I was asking this question, say 30 or 40 years ago, we didn't have that much data in what kinds of things cause cancer. But now we do have a lot of data and enough hard evidence to make very firm conclusions. But these aren't things that just cause cancer. These are also things that contribute to all chronic illnesses. So all chronic illnesses, takes it down to the cellular level. All chronic illnesses are rooted in cellular stress. When we stress our cells, our body is made of cells. Everything that happens in the body is due to the actions of cells. And when you stress your cells, you put yourself at risk. So the question is to ask is what stresses our cells? And that gives you the risk factors for cancer, chronic illness. And then we can talk a little bit about why they might cause cancer instead of some other chronic illness too.
Yeah, let's dive into that because
All right.
yeah, like I just want to dive into that because it's so true.
Well, we covered this a little bit with our last podcast. And when you take things down to the cellular level, you look at our cells as little microscopic machines. Every cell in the body has a job. But structurally, every cell is somewhat alike. They all have basically the same parts, and those parts have been modified for different jobs. Like the heart cell pumps the heart. Thyroid cells make thyroid hormone, but they're all structurally the same, and they have similar requirements for health, but also are affected by similar stresses. So when you get down to stress factors that stress cells and put them at risk, diet, you know all about that one, and we
Mhm.
can talk about those dietary factors. Toxic substances in the environment, that's a big one that's driving most chronic illnesses is there's
Mhm.
so many abnormal chemicals in our environment now that are affecting every single one of us. We hear about forever chemicals and all of these things that are in our water supply and our food. And these factors are affecting our cellular health. Mental stress, who isn't?
Right.
We're all pushing the stress button continually, but we're not sleeping. Average sleep in America is 6.5 hours. We're just not sleeping enough to really stay healthy. And it's because sleep is when our cells recover from working all day. So if you only do 6.5 hours sleep, you start your next day with a deficit in cellular functions. And you build on that for every day that you do it. Number four is we're not moving. Exercise, the most important part of exercise is increasing blood flow, which flushes away toxic substances and other buildup of junk around of our cells. So that's really important. And then that fifth factor is microbes. And we'll get into that more because that's a big one. That's a differentiator. But those are the main factors. Now, one of the reasons people end up with different illnesses is because we all have different genes, and genes aren't necessarily a cause of illness. I caution people, don't define your genes as the cause. What they do is define how we tolerate different kinds of stress. And some people may have genes that put them at more risk of being stressed by some factors more than others or more than other individuals.
It's so funny because it's like this is the pattern of chronic illness, like root causes, right? This is what people,
That's it.
hear over and over and over again. What is so interesting is just how deep of a dive we can do on each of them and how they impact our cellular wellness. Let's touch a little bit on maybe diet, and then let's dive into microbes.
All right. All right. Yeah. So yeah, we'll definitely take a deep dive into that microbe factor because
Yeah.
it's really fascinating when you start digging into it. But diet, it's all that we are not living within the parameters set by our genes. All right. So our genes were set over hundreds of thousands of years of living a certain way. A polar bear wouldn't make it in Florida because its genes define that it needs to live on ice. A cactus wouldn't make it in the Amazon because its genes define that it's not going to tolerate highly wet conditions. So, how your great ancestors lived through time defines what you should eat, how you should live. So, when we look at those stress factors, people ate a forage food diet for hundreds of thousands of years. And that was about two-thirds wild plant matter, digging roots, wild berries, leaves, anything that might provide calories. But nature's pretty skimpy in calories, so there wasn't a lot of calories, whether you looked at plant sources or meat sources. The animals that they were eating for food were very, very lean. There wasn't much fat. So food didn't have much carbohydrate and fat. You had to eat a lot of it to survive. So humans ate a lot of food and they got a lot of fiber in from the vegetables. So all of those nutrients that they were getting, they're not getting tons of fat and carbohydrates. So our cells learned to run lean. We don't need to eat much carbohydrate and fat to survive. But our gut needs all that fiber. We need all those phytochemicals from the nutrients. And we need more than just the meat from the animal to stay healthy in a normal situation. So we did that for hundreds of thousands of years, and populations on Earth were pretty low. But we started to run out of food about 10,000 years ago. So we started farming. And that we had to give up roaming. We had to stay and farm. We farmed grains because they could be stored. But grains were very, very different from our other food supply. But we almost switched entirely to grains and beans and feeding our animals grains and beans 10,000 years ago. And we're just not really doing well ever since. And now we eat fewer vegetables, fewer natural meats than we ever have before. We're eating mostly grains and beans, or animals fed on grains and beans, or dairy. And our GI tract suffers, every part of us suffers. The Earth environment through most of that time was very, very clean. That started changing about 3,000 years ago when people started burning coal. So when you burn coal, it spews out these hydrocarbons that have been changed by being inside the earth, but also they've been had all kinds of heavy metals like mercury and cadmium and lead buried into the coal. So when we burn that, but it was pretty small scale, wasn't that big. It wasn't until we started using petroleum and population started growing so rapidly that we were using so much of this stuff that pollution, contamination of our food, air, and water really became a problem. And also with modern lighting and everything else, we started sleeping less. Machines do all the work. We exercise less. So we're living way outside the margins set by our genes. And that's put us in a pretty desperate place for really how we should be living. And that sets us up for issues with microbes, which are opportunists.
Let's dive in.
All right. So microbes have one purpose: to make more microbes. And to do that, they need to eat. And all food for all living organisms is other living organisms. So you have to, everything that is consumed as food was something that is or was alive. So the microbes that we have issues with are host dependent. They get their host from they get their food from a host. And a lot of microbes can use different hosts, but we don't really want to give that away freely. So they try to get in our body. And some of them make their way in and they hang around, but they're not necessarily in us. So the largest concentration of microbes in the body are in our gut, and they're living off what I call free food. We eat food, and bacteria, the things that we don't absorb, they can feed off of. And now we have this long-term relationship that we have friendly flora, microbes that are actually favorable for us that live in our gut. But they have to be contained, because even if you get your friendly flora deep inside your tissues, that can be a real problem, because they're going to eat anything that is living. They're going to eat our cells. So you have to contain those things inside the gut. The other is on the skin. Our bacteria on our skin live off of oils that we secrete to keep our skin lubricated. So their concentrations are pretty low. There's not much food, but that skin barrier keeps them on the surface, keeps them out. So we don't want them inside our bloodstream or inside of our tissues. But microbes are always trying to get across those barriers, and that's why we have an immune system to protect us. So microbes are constantly trying to get across barriers, break through the skin or the gut or through our sinuses or through our gums to get to the bloodstream, to get to our tissues. And that is what's called an infection, when you have something new that breaks through a barrier. And your immune system does a pretty good job of preventing those things from becoming an issue. Sometimes we get enough symptoms that it's a noticeable infection, but a lot of times it's happening without us being aware. But what I've learned in my study through studying tick-borne microbes and a lot of other different kinds of microbe situations is that microbes get past our immune system. Viruses, bacteria, protozoa, yeast. And when they do, they invade our cells. Now, if our cells are healthy, they can just go dormant. So this is happening all through our lifetime. Right now, while you and I are talking, things are trickling, bacteria are trickling from our gums, from our sinuses, from our gut, into our bloodstream, getting past our immune system, invading our cells, becoming dormant. This happens in everybody. It has been identified in blood of healthy individuals, dormant microbes inside red blood cells. It's been identified in tissue biopsies, brain biopsies. So there's a lot of accumulating evidence, and they're actually calling it the dormant blood and tissue microbiome. So if you're healthy, if you eat a good diet, you're not exposed to toxic substances, you get plenty of sleep, you get plenty of exercise, they just stay dormant. But if they have the opportunity, if cells are weakened by stress, then they can reactivate and invade other cells. They emerge, they invade other cells, and they start breaking our tissues down to create a food supply, to grow more microbes, because that's what they do. So that is the connection to chronic illnesses. And there's accumulating evidence that many, if not most, of chronic illnesses occur as a result of that. But chronic illness here, we're referring to things like chronic Lyme disease, multiple sclerosis, dementia, those kinds of things. Cancer is a little bit different. We don't have all the reasons why some things actually go one way or another way and turn to cancer. But so we can talk about that one a bit.
Yeah, I would like to. I have heard that cancer is protective, and then because of a lack of cellular wellness, then it goes unchecked, and that's when it can become deadly. Is that what you have found or have seen to be true?
Well, here we're talking about, that most things that I will tell you, I have very hard evidence of. So some things that I'm getting ready to talk about now are somewhat speculation or theoretical with evidence to back up that
Okay.
speculation. So when you look at microbes and cells, it's really interesting how they can connect together and some characteristics. So when you talk about our cells, the growth of our cells is restricted. And what I mean by that is you can only have so many cells in a heart. You can only have so many cells in a liver. You can only have so many cells in your nose. And that growth, that restricted growth, is very well defined by the genetics of the cell. The chromosomes in the cell define that it's always aware of the other cells around it, and it's not going to start growing unless its neighbor next door is missed and needs a replacement. So that restricted growth keeps everything functioning, and you have to do that to grow, to have something that works as a whole, like a whole human being. That's very different than bacteria. I mentioned that bacteria only have one purpose, and that's to make more bacteria. And that's
Mhm.
true of any microbe. So all microbes, bacteria, viruses, protozoa, yeast, all of them have unrestricted growth. And what that means is as long as there's a food supply, they'll keep growing. As long as there's a food supply and conditions are favorable for growth, they'll keep growing.
Okay.
So if you put a bacteria in a petri dish with the right conditions and food, it will just keep growing until there's no food left. So that's unrestricted growth. Well, very interestingly, when one of our cells turns into cancer, it takes on unrestricted growth. It starts growing just like a bacteria, just like a bacteria. So here's where it gets really interesting. We have a lot of microbe bacterial connections. So the first one was with Epstein-Barr virus. I think this was back in the 60s, maybe. They connected it with a specific strain of Epstein-Barr with a tumor called Burkitt's lymphoma. And since then, we've made a lot of microbe tumor cancer connections. Right now, 20% of cancers are associated with microbes. But when you start looking even deeper, recent studies have found that different tumors have their own unique microbiome of different bacteria that are actually living inside the cancer cells. And I found that to be really interesting. But then I found one study that made this really remarkable connection between microbes and cancer that really has changed the way I've thought forever.
Let's hear it because I'm absolutely fascinated right now.
Right? Researchers were trying to figure out what causes cancer. So they were using a species of algae. And algae has what are called eukaryotic cells. They're complex cells like our cells. And
Mhm.
then these researchers, that's something that's pretty easy to use in a lab. So it's like, how can we make these cells turn to cancer? And so they took the cells and the algae and they exposed them to all kinds of chemical carcinogens and all of these factors that you would think this is going to do it. It just killed the algae every time.
Hmm.
So then they had another thought. Well, what if it's stressed? What if these cells are stressed? So they put the algae in the closet, couldn't get sunlight, and that stressed the cells, that weakened the cells. And they exposed it to carcinogens, then still killed it. But they introduced a bacteria that invades this algae and lives inside the cells. And normally, if the cells are healthy, it's a symbiotic relationship that the bacteria can live inside the cells. This is really common in nature. We're finding that bacteria live inside cells of another organism.
Hmm. Okay.
So they were looking at this. They infected the algae with this bacteria, and then they put it in the closet and weakened the cells, turned to cancer every single time. And the
Interesting.
really interesting thing was then they did the research and they found that the bacteria was inserting its gene for unregulated growth into the cells of the algae and making them take on that unrestricted growth.
That is very interesting. Huh.
Yeah. So the next idea, what thought was the next question is, why would they do that? Well, the researchers didn't answer that question, but I've been thinking about it a lot. And I thought, if you were a bacteria and this algae was your food, wouldn't you want to just grow a lot of it and have it at your own control? So my thought is the bacteria were actually gardening a food supply. They were growing a food supply to grow more bacteria. They were controlling the food supply. And so when you start looking at that microbe connection with cancer, it's really fascinating that our bacteria, our other microbes actually utilizing making cells grow so they have this food supply that's readily available and continuing to grow. And it takes on a life of its own. It brings in its own blood supply. And it's like, wow. And so that part's speculation, pure
Pure
speculation,
play,
but
but
it's
it makes a lot of
interesting to
sense.
think about. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting to think about.
It'll be so interesting to see if they pursue that line of thought and what they find
Yeah,
if they do. It makes a lot of sense, though,
it does.
really. So, with this relationship, with the knowledge that our cells have these dormant or even symbiotic relationships with maybe these stealth pathogens or these bacteria that are just in our bodies that keep us going, right? Like I've heard that
Right.
like a lot of our cells are actually viruses, and there's just a symbiotic relationship. Like there's just a lot of information out there, and it's hard to keep it all straight sometimes, especially like in the moment when it just pops up. But um so knowing 20% of cancers are associated with microbiomes, we know that this bacteria can change the cell to become unregulated growth. What does that mean in terms of prevention
Yeah,
from what your research is and what you speculate on an educated level?
right. Yeah, I think a big part of it is keep your cells healthy. It wasn't until the cells got stressed that they turned into cancer. So, and there's a lot of things we don't know about as far as is it one microbe? Is it several microbes working together that cause a certain cancer? Is it all cancers? Is it just some cancers? Are there genetic factors? We know that there are certain genetic factors that may put people at risk of certain stress factors, certain microbes. So there's a lot that we still need to learn that's valuable, but it's pretty simple to say, okay, these stress factors are a really important thing. Our cancer is so much greater than it has been in the past. And but you look at other times in history, it's like where people were crowded and there was a lot of pollution, there was a lot of illness and cancer, i.e., industrial London, where they were burning coal to heat their homes and burning coal to cook food and burning coal in the factories. And there was a constant coal smog. That was really, really super bad pollution. People were living crowded, conditions were sanitary. There was a lot of disease. A lot of people died. So these factors, those 5 factors, what you eat, the toxins you're exposed to, whether you get sleep, whether you move, and just by chance, which microbes you pick up, those are the variables that really define. Now, some things you can't change. We can't always predict what microbes we're going to pick up in life, and some may be worse than others, but we can definitely change our diet. We can change our exposure to toxic substances. We have some control over that. We can change how much we're sleeping. We can control that and how much we're moving. But there's one thing you can do to protect yourself against cancer, against this microbe factor that most people aren't doing.
Okay, you've piqued my curiosity.
Herbs. Now
Oh
we're getting to the
yeah,
herbs.
now we're
Yeah,
getting to the herbs. All
right.
right, let's talk about that connection.
So it gets back to that, yeah, for hundreds of thousands of years, people ate wild plants. And even when we started eating seeds and grain, we still were doing medicinal herbs and culinary herbs in our
Mhm.
food. And we've done that regularly, but we gave it up about 100 years ago and traded it for drug therapy. And we've put the herbs aside. They're a part of us. They're a really important part of us. And there's been herbs have quite frankly gotten a lot of bad press, and a lot of it is coming
Yes.
from the pharmaceutical industry and the
Hmm.
medical industry. But of all the things that we can do to protect ourselves from stress factors and lower our risk of things, herbs have more value than really anything else we can do by far. And it gets down to the chemistry of the plant and what the plant is doing. And that is why it has so much protective value.
So let's dive into herbs. I know a lot of herbs they're immune protective. They are maybe even immune stimulating. They help regulate stress. Let's maybe talk about what are some commonalities that herbs have, and then how in our modern society, in our modern culture, how can we get quality herbs? Because,
Sure.
you know, I think, people typically when they learn new information, they're really excited and they want to go out and buy something off of the shelf. And that might not necessarily be the best option. You kind of want to go in with an educated approach. So,
Sure.
what can people expect when they're going to be taking herbs and how can they get good ones?
Yeah. A lot of people focus on what the herbs are doing. And that's been the focus of most traditional herbal medicine over the
Mm-hmm.
years because it was observational. It's like, okay, certain people have these symptoms, we can give them herbs. It seems to help. But my interest has been how the herbs do what they're doing. And so when we look at herbs, they come from plants, but they're plants that mesh well with our biochemistry. They're things that humans have been using for thousands upon thousands of years. And most plants actually are beneficial to us, but some plants are actually toxic in various ways. So some of that toxicity can be useful. About half of our drugs come from plants. A lot of our chemotherapy agents come from plants, but these are toxic, poisonous plants, not something we would use in herbal therapy. So here, when I talk about herbs, I'm talking about plants that really have a low potential to harm us. And how we're seeing the benefits is we're basically borrowing from the plant. We're borrowing the plant's defense and regulatory systems. So plants have to protect their cells against those invasive microbes, right? Algae has to protect its cells. And plants have to regulate their cellular functions. So they use a lot of chemical messengers that are very similar to our hormones. So plants basically use chemicals to neutralize free radicals, toxic substances, radiation, but especially microbes. So all plants are going to have antimicrobial properties against viruses, bacteria, protozoa, yeast, even parasites. So that's kind of built into every plant. Now, some plant, depending on the stresses it has in its environment, may have stronger antimicrobial properties than others. It depends on that environment where the plant lives and what kind of stress factors are in it. So when we take an herb, we're borrowing those things. But interestingly, unlike an antibiotic, when you take an herb, the antimicrobial properties you're getting are selective. So they're not going to disrupt your normal flora in your gut and on your skin. And this has actually been well documented by scientific studies, and it's really fascinating. But it makes sense. That plant is going to take care of its normal flora, but wants to suppress potential pathogens that could harm it.
Mm-hmm.
So when we take that plant, we're getting those beneficial properties, but also the regulatory properties. So it can help balance some of our stress hormones and things that are not good for us. When I look at an herb, what I see is a cell protection system. And instead of looking at it like, okay, I'm going to use this herb to treat this symptom, I'm looking at it to go, how do we reduce cellular stress in the body? So plants have anti-diabetic properties that protect us from excessive carbohydrates. I mean, there are just so many properties that they protect us from. And again, all plants have antimicrobial properties that are selective for pathogens. So you look at these broad spectrum cell protection, anti-inflammatory, hormone balancing effects, and it's a pretty remarkable spectrum of benefits that you can get from taking herbs. Now, if you blend multiple herbs together, you get a synergy between the herbs because, as I said, different herbs from different environments are going to handle different stress factors slightly differently. So you're going to have a broader spectrum of coverage. So, very interestingly, every herb that I've ever researched has also been found to have anti-cancer properties. It's known to lower certain kinds of cancer risk. So you put two and two together, and it wouldn't be surprising because the herbs are having this effect of protecting cells from stress. So they're allowing our cells to flourish, at the same time protecting those cells from threatening microbes or reactivation of microbes that are already there. So you put all those factors together, and what we talked about as far as how microbes might be associated with inciting a cancer, it's kind of a no-brainer that the herbs are really important part of our whole awareness as far as trying to reduce our cancer risk, but also our risk of all chronic illnesses.
Yeah. I remember when I first started researching herbs, and in the beginning, when you're new to health, you research everything individually,
Yeah.
right? And you like, oh, well, this does this, so I'm going to do that. This does this, so I'm going to do that. And you kind of go down all these little different rabbit holes of pursuing different things that you learn. And then eventually, as time goes on, you learn they all overlap, and you try to find a realistic way to just live healthy. So you're not going 100% in one direction and then kind of squirreling off into another one. Are
Sure.
there ways of getting the herbs that are more beneficial than others? Okay, so I'm thinking like cooking herbs, right? Like I'm a big fan of using herbs, not just for their health benefits, but also because they make food taste good, right?
Right.
And so I'm always adding, I don't ever just use salt and pepper. I'm always throwing in different herbs and spices. And I do that for flavor, but also because I know that there's benefits associated with them.
Yeah.
But also there's teas and tonics and tinctures and capsules. And my question is, there's a lot of snake oil out there. There's a lot of companies that like
Marketing gimmicks. Yes.
marketing gimmicks, yeah, but also maybe I don't know how intentional or unintentional it is, but I have to think that every method gives us a benefit in a different way. Like, do our teas actually giving us the properties that we're looking for, or does it disable some while enhancing others? Like cooked tomatoes versus raw tomatoes, right? So I'm kind of like, my question is, and I don't know how much your knowledge of this is. I'm assuming you know some because you have your own line of supplements and they're very well recommended. How can we get the most benefit out of these herbs?
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, I think getting them any way you can is really good. I use a lot of herbs, culinary herbs and spices. They do make our food taste good, but that's not their real purpose. The spice trade was built around reducing spoilage in food. So you think about it, before refrigeration, food went bad pretty quickly, especially meats. And so all these antimicrobial properties of all of these culinary herbs and spices reduced the bacteria colonization of the food and reduced how fast bacteria could grow within the food. So it reduced spoilage. And that was the big reason why herbs and spices were so remarkably important. So even back then, they were taking advantage of those antimicrobial properties. The ones that tasted good ended up being culinary herbs. The ones that didn't taste so good ended up being medicinal herbs. But they all have very similar properties. And many of those medicinal herbs that we put in that category of protecting our health are called adaptogens because they balance our stress hormones and protect our cells. And they do all these wonderful things for us. Getting the level that you would want to protect your health, probably the level that our ancient ancestors were getting just in their food every day, you could get it by going back and foraging your diet completely and processing all of your herbs and using lots and lots of that in your food is just impractical. So, taking advantage of the situation, living in the modern world, we can get those same benefits through products. And you can get a lot of good through teas and other ways to enjoy the specific herb. But again, a lot of really great herbs don't taste so good. You wouldn't want to do it as a tea or put it in your food. Some of the very best herbs, like andrographis, which has wonderful antiviral properties. It's called the king of bitters because it's so remarkably bitter. And it just has to do with the chemicals in the plant, but many of those chemicals are actually very beneficial to us. So getting them in products, tinctures are one way to do that. And so what we're doing with a tincture is taking the plant and soaking it in water and alcohol. And then you throw away the plant parts because that's just fiber. All you want is the chemistry. So you take the water and alcohol that has those chemicals in it after it's been saturated with the plant for a certain period of time. That's called an extract or a tincture. But it's so that's a pretty good way. A lot of what people are getting, though, as far as products on the market, are whole herb powders. If you're taking a capsule and it just, you look on the side of the bottle and it lists the milligram quantity or a list of herbs with a milligram quantity, and that's all it says, you're getting a whole herb powder. And basically what they're doing is taking the plant parts, whether that's a root, stems, leaves, whatever, drying it, crushing it up, and putting it in a powder. Basically, you're getting a lot of fiber, not much chemical. And the value of those things is like really small, hardly any at all. So where I found the most benefit are standardized extracts. If you really want to get the full benefit or you're trying to overcome a situation, some kind of a health issue that you really want to get the full chemistry of the plant, do a standardized extracts. Now, this is a powder. The capsule looks just like that whole herb powder that you find in most products. But what they're doing is taking a tincture of the plant, spraying it on a surface, drying off the water and alcohol, and collecting the powder. So it's the pure chemistry. It's the pure phytochemistry of the plant without the fiber. So it's 10 times more concentrated than a whole herb powder. So the way to find that is you look on the bottle and it will say standardized extract. It'll give the scientific name of the herb and a standardized extract and talk about that they're generally standardized to a specific phytochemical that they'll use as a marker. And it'll say that on the bottle. And then you can be confident this is something that's somewhere between 5 and 10 times more concentrated than what most products are. But then you do want something that's pure. So part of that is testing. And you can get, a reputable company will get a certificate of analysis that is whatever supplier is supplying that herb product will get a third-party testing looking for chemicals, making sure it's the right species, making sure the standardization is proper. But that's good. That's a higher level. We actually at our company do another level of testing that we get a sample from that batch, have it independently tested, and most of the time it's in line with the certificate of analysis, but sometimes it's not, and we don't buy that. Then we test it also during the manufacturing process to make sure it's blended. So reputable companies, and there are many out there, will actually go through all those steps. But it is important for people to know those things. And so I saw a company the other day that had posted their certificate of analysis. They were bragging about how pure the specimen was, but I realized they were using whole herb extracts that probably had virtually no value. Yeah. So it's standardized extract. That's really important. Testing is really important. And just, a company that really is in it to make a difference in people's lives and not just sell a bunch of product.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the adaptogens and stuff I've taken over the years, and I don't think I've ever seen standardized extract.
Makes a difference. Well, it's okay. I mean, it's like the mushrooms, the things that taste good. I think it's fine to buy whole herb mushroom powders like reishi and cordyceps and just scoop them up and put them in your smoothie or whatever. But you need 2 or 3 teaspoons to really make a difference to get what you would get in one capsule of a standardized extract.
And they don't taste good.
And a lot of them don't necessarily taste good either. Yeah.
Yeah, so you kind of choke them down, which a lot of people are willing to do. I personally have done that. I just don't find it something I can do long term.
Yeah. I've even done andrographis in the bitters, and I like the bitterness sometimes, or just like to experience the flavor of an herb, but a
Mm.
lot of people, you have to get used to that. That's for sure.
Yeah, and it's interesting because other cultures, I think almost every culture except for maybe the first world, like especially America, we don't really have bitter on our palate. It's not something
No,
that
it's true.
children are introduced to. It's not something that we regularly consume in our diet compared to other cultures, especially like Eastern Europe is really into bitters and things like that. So in America specifically, like we don't eat bitter food ever, right? Like
That's
that's
true.
why people have like a problem with like quinoa because quinoa has a bitter flavor to it, right?
Yeah.
And people don't like that. So that's where capsules are nice. And then, but also, I do think it's a good idea if you're into health and you're into wanting to, if you have chronic illness stuff, learning to expand your palate to
Yeah.
include bitter is a really good idea, but it is hard to do. You have to go out seeking it. It takes a lot of mental effort and research and things like that. So when you don't have the capacity for that, the standardized extracts with the certificate of analysis, and I think that that's probably a good place to start, and then
For
kind of
sure.
explore if this is something that you think, oh, this is really going to benefit me, which I think it would benefit. I know it will benefit, especially those who are in the throes of chronic illness. I mean, you were there,
Yeah.
how powerful they can be. And, nothing's a magic bullet. You have to have all five: the diet, reduce environmental toxins, sleep. You need to be moving. You need to take care of your microbiome. Your gut is another word for it. Going to a company that's reputable, yours is reputable, and it's affordable, which I really like. I appreciate that of your
Oh,
company.
good. Good. Thank you.
That's purely me going and looking and recommending it to people since I've been introduced to it. And they're always happy with the prices. Throwing that out there for you. As we're wrapping up this episode with the microbiome and cancer, and then, cellular wellness really is the key. Like, that's the point, is like you have to take care of your cells, and that takes care of your health. Right. So, as we're wrapping this up, is there anything that you would like our listeners to walk away with? Like, if there's one thing that they remember, what do you think that would be?
Yeah, cellular health is the key to everything. We don't think that in that way. We think
Mm-mm.
about our body as a whole, but our whole is made up of these trillions of little individual things, and our health is a direct reflection of the health of our cells. So, feeding ourselves right, not polluting ourselves with contaminants, making sure our cells have plenty of downtime to recover, making sure that we give them lots of blood flow from being physically active, and protecting them from microbes. That's a formula for wellness. Absolutely. You do those things and you'll protect yourself from every illness, every cancer, and you'll just get a lot more out of life.
Yeah, quality of life matters just as much as quantity.
Truly.
We don't know our days, but we can make our days count and enjoy them to the fullest when we're taking care of ourselves. And I think sometimes when we're in the throes of chronic illness, it can be hard to see past that.
Yeah.
It can be really difficult. And I think one thing is, once you start taking care of yourself, you took a long time to get sick. It's going to take some time to get better. So don't give up on the
Yeah.
process. I always think of, like, when you're on Pinterest or when you're on Instagram, there's like 50 things to take care of yourself or 25 things to take care of yourself. Really, these five are what it boils down to. So focusing on those five,
Yep.
and maybe focusing on one, mastering it, moving on to another. This is just the health coach in me. You don't have to do everything all at once, but take the one thing that you're lacking on and start making improvements there. You don't need to be perfect from day one, but just start taking steps and start figuring things out slowly that way. And then you can improve upon it in time, because research is always coming out. There's, new things we're learning all the time, especially about the microbiome and strains of bacteria. And, I was just reading about how ivermectin protects the gut and actually makes the gut, it improves a certain strain of bacteria that prevented COVID, long COVID or severe COVID and things like that. It was super interesting. but it comes down to the microbiome and the gut and bacteria. And it's so interesting to me. So these are the 5 places to start. If people want to connect with you, maybe get connected to your book, I will make sure to put the link. What is your company and how can they follow you and support you?
Oh, the company is vitalplan.com. We've been in business over a decade, really helping people struggling with health adversities predominantly, but also keeping people healthy too. So it's not just products, it's protocols to help people out, to guide them through these sometimes treacherous journeys that they have to navigate. And yeah, it's just getting everybody to a better place, changing the conversation about how we think about health and wellness, and taking more responsibility ourselves to do the things, because most of the things that really matter for staying healthy come outside of a doctor's office.
Thank you so much again for joining me and talking about this. Cancer, it's a big deal. I was telling you before we started, I just learned 2 of my friends are dealing with pancreatic cancer. And,
Yeah.
one is 100% the allopathic route, and the other one is like, I need some options. I don't want radiation. I don't want surgery. And so obviously this is not a treatment for cancer, but the fact is that there's still steps that he can take to support his body now, you know?
I think that's important. And, maybe just to wind up, to say that I am not suggesting in any way that we throw out conventional therapies for cancer. I think we do need to kill the cancer cells. But if that's all you're doing and you're not restoring the health of the cells that are there, then you're going to put yourself at risk for a lot of other things. And looking at a pathway where we're using conventional therapies to reduce the cancer load, to kill the cancer cells, but at the same time, doing all these other things, including herbs, to support the health of the rest of our cells in our body. That's really important. That's very important.
Yeah. And it's all chronic illness, right? You're in the throes of it. Maybe you're taking immunotherapy and all of that, but you still have controlled. I was reading that only 10 to 20% of health outcomes come from medications and doctors. So 80 to
Yep.
90% is purely on ourselves. And that can be
Yep.
overwhelming, but I think it's incredibly empowering to be like, okay, like I do have control. And again, these 5 things are not as difficult as they sound.
No,
So it takes change. And if you're willing to make the change, your health will improve no matter where you're starting from.
absolutely. Yeah, I never give up on anybody that it's a lot of people don't adopt it just overnight all at one time. It takes time to make these changes and understand and get used to these things. Just make them a habit in your life. I mean, it was a real struggle for me to learn just to take the herbs twice a day. Things like that. Changing your diet, if you're changing from foods that you've never eaten, or from things that you're used to foods you've never eaten before, and just resorting your lifestyle, that can be challenging. But the more you do it, the reward is your life's going to be so much better.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for joining me and having this conversation.
Pleasure.
I learned just as much. A few times I'm like, oh, I'm just sitting here processing. I'm like, keep talking because like I'm just learning. So I really appreciate you coming on. I appreciate the way you explain things. I love your book. So I'm going to make sure to link it.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. If you found this episode helpful, would you do me a favor and help others find it by leaving a review, sharing a screenshot on social media, or sharing the link with a friend? By you sharing what you've learned, others are able to find this podcast and join our community. Be sure to check out my website, www.roadtolivingwhole.com, for over 160 delicious recipes, a variety of meal plans, and a blog packed full of even more healthy living tips. If you'd like to learn more about how to work with me as your coach, You can schedule a free consult through www.roadtolivingwhole.com/health-coaching/. Until next time, friend. Bye.